The crystalline spires of Elysium Prime, like sharpened diamond shards, pierced the violet canvas above. A man by the name of Ethan Vance adjusted his attire, a futile gesture against the manufactured atmosphere that always seemed too flawless, too regulated. His transport vehicle descended through layers of defensive energy shields, each shimmer representing a vast expenditure dedicated to preserving the galaxy's most unusual collection, or its most exquisite prisoners. "Welcome to Elysium Prime, Dr. Vance," a holographic projection of Madame Serafina graced his pod, her silver hair a meticulously arranged crown of braids and her smile failing to touch her eyes. "I trust your travel was comfortable?" "As comfortable as a journey spanning 20 light-years can be," Ethan replied, his tone professional despite the way the hologram seemed to scrutinize him. "I appreciate the personal welcome, though it wasn't strictly required." "Nonsense," the hologram flickered as they passed through another barrier. "Elysium Prime prides itself on hospitality. Besides, it's not every day we host the renowned Dr. Vance. Your findings on the Centauri breeding operations caused quite the stir." Ethan suppressed a grimace. Those facilities had been shut down following his report, and he had earned some powerful adversaries in the process. "I simply report my observations, Madame Serafina, and please, call me Victoria." Her hologram indicated the nearing landing platform. "I eagerly await the opportunity to display how we exceed all galactic standards for the care of exotic species." The pod touched down on a platform made of lustrous marble, real marble, Ethan noted, not a synthetic imitation. The expense was mind-boggling. As he exited, the actual Madame Serafina greeted him, flanked by an entourage of attendants in pristine white uniforms. "Dr. Vance," she extended a hand adorned with rings that likely cost more than his yearly salary, even more striking in person than your holosuggist. Ethan briefly shook her hand, noting the calculated warmth of her grip. "You'll forgive me if I wish to begin the evaluation immediately, my schedule is somewhat constrained." "Of course," she smiled, all impeccable teeth and practiced charm. "Though surely you'll join me for dinner this evening? We're having authentic Relian crystal fish perhaps?" Ethan pulled out his data tablet. "Now, about those inspection protocols." The guided tour began in what Madame Serafina referred to as the Legacy Wing, a sprawling collection of habitats designed to replicate various environments from across the galaxy. Ethan diligently recorded everything: temperature controls, feeding schedules, and behavioral enrichment programs. Everything appeared to be perfect, too perfect. "And here," Madame Serafina gestured to an elaborate enclosure, "is our most recent acquisition, the Luminary Canid." Ethan's breath caught. Behind the containment field stood a humanoid female with skin of a violet hue that seemed to shimmer with an inner radiance. Her eyes were like gazing into the heart of a nebula, swirling with colors he'd only observed in deep space photographs. Long, pointed ears swept back from her face, adorned with what appeared to be naturally forming crystalline structures. "A most fascinating specimen," Madame Serafina continued. "Found amongst the ruins of a lost civilization. Observe," she announced. She mimicked sounds and movements quite well, quite an entertaining trick. The creature, no, the woman, Ethan corrected himself mentally, was, in fact, mirroring the movements of a nearby attendant. Yet there was something unusual about it, her mimicry was too precise, too intelligent. "What research has been done on her species?" Ethan inquired, keeping his voice neutral as he jotted notes. "The usual preliminary studies. Brain structure suggests minimal cognitive function beyond basic problem solving. She's quite docile, really," Madame Serafina said with a dismissive wave. "Shall we move on to the Venusian shapeshifters?" But Ethan couldn't move on. The Luminary Canid had turned to face him directly, and her eyes, there was something there, something that screamed intelligence. She raised her hand in what seemed like a casual stretch, but her fingers moved in a distinct pattern. Ethan, having studied xenolinguistics, recognized it as the beginning of a mathematical sequence. "I'd like to review her full file," he stated. Of course, Madame Serafina's smile tightened slightly. "Though I must warn you it's rather dull reading. Now, about that dinner." That night, long after declining Madame Serafina's invitation to dine with a practiced excuse regarding review protocols, Ethan cautiously made his way back to the luminary canid's enclosure. The night cycle had dimmed the artificial illumination to a soft, blue glow, reminiscent of Earth's moonlight. She was waiting for him, in the dust of her enclosure, complex equations scrawled across the ground, temporal physics, if he wasn't mistaken, advanced temporal physics. I wondered how long it would take you to return, a voice whispered in his mind. Her actual lips didn't move, but her eyes fixed on his with undeniable intelligence. Most humans just stare and move on. But you see more than most, don't you, Dr. Vance? Ethan's hand trembled as he reached for his tablet. You're sentient? Brilliant deduction, the mental voice carried a note of sarcasm. Would you like to check my enclosure for proper enrichment toys while you're at it? I'm sorry, he whispered. I didn't know. Few do. She moved closer to the containment field, and Ethan noticed intricate markings across her skin that seemed to shift and change in the dim light. I'm Lyra, last of the Aaron, well, last free one anyway. There are more of us here, in other collections. The bitterness in her mental voice was palpable. We make such fascinating pets, don't we? With our pretty lights and clever tricks. Ethan's mind raced with the implications. If she was sentient, and if there were others, this was illegal, beyond illegal. This is treacherous, Dr. Vance, Lyra's mental voice carried a warning. The walls have ears here, and Madame Serafina doesn't take kindly to those who threaten her collection. As if on cue, footsteps echoed from the corridor. Lyra quickly erased the equations with her foot, resuming the vacant expression she wore during the day. I'll help you, Ethan promised quietly. Somehow, I'll get you out of here. Lyra's response came as he turned to leave, tinged with both hope and cynicism. My hero. Let's hope you survive long enough to try. Ethan walked away just as a guard rounded the corner, his mind whirling with his discovery. This was not just a violation of exotic animal treatment protocols, it was slavery, trafficking, and who knew what else. As he made his way back to his quarters, he could still feel Lyra's star-like eyes watching him, and her last words echoed in his mind. She was correct, he'd need to be careful. One wrong move and he would likely disappear into one of Elysium Prime's flawless enclosures himself. But he couldn't walk away, not now, not after seeing those equations, those eyes, that intelligence. Whatever the risk, he had to help her expose the truth. In his quarters, he began to plan, knowing that from that moment on every move he made would be under surveillance. The game had begun, and the stakes were higher than he'd ever encountered. Ethan emerged from his quarters the next morning with a meticulously constructed plan and promptly watched it fall apart when Madame Serafina intercepted him in the entryway. Dr. Vance, I trust you slept well? Her smile was as sharp as a razor. I thought we might start today's evaluation in the aquatic wing. Actually, Ethan said, forcing casualness into his tone, I'd like to continue my observations of the luminary canid. There are some behavioral patterns I need to document. Something flickered behind Madame Serafina's eyes. Surely our Molian sea serpents would be more intriguing, their mating season is quite spectacular. Professional thoroughness requires I complete each section before moving on. He met her gaze steadily, unless there's some reason you'd prefer I didn't. Of course not. Her laugh tinkled like breaking glass. Though I must warn you, she can be rather unpredictable. The warning in her voice was clear, but Ethan simply smiled. Unpredictable specimens are my specialty. At the enclosure, Lyra was already awake, her violet skin seeming to capture and reflect the morning light. She turned as they approached, and Ethan could have sworn he saw amusement dance in those stellar eyes. Observe, Madame Serafina announced proudly. Subject, demonstrate cognitive response. Lyra stretched languidly, deliberately ignoring the command. Instead, she fixed her gaze on Ethan and began a series of fluid movements that might have seemed random to others, but which he recognized as a complex mathematical equation expressed through gesture. She seems distracted today, Madame Serafina said tightly. Perhaps we should. Fascinating, Ethan interrupted, pulling out his tablet. Would you mind if I observed alone? Some specimens behave differently without an audience. I hardly think it violates standard protocol, he added smoothly. After Madame Serafina finally departed, bristling with barely concealed suspicion, Lyra's mental voice brushed against his consciousness like silk. Someone's feeling brave this morning. Her mental tone carried a teasing lilt. Though your attempts at subtle manipulation need some work. Ethan approached the containment field, pretending to make notes. I don't know what you mean. I'm simply being thorough in my evaluation. Of course you are. Lyra moved closer, her movements carrying a predatory grace. And I suppose your elevated heart rate is purely professional interest. He nearly dropped his tablet. You can sense that? Among other things. Her mental laugh was like stardust. Your species is remarkably transparent. Says the woman who glows in the dark, he retorted. Bioluminescence is a perfectly evolved trait, she replied, then added with what he could have sworn was a mental smirk, though I notice you've been admiring it. Ethan felt heat creep up his neck. I'm admiring the scientific implications. Is that what humans call it? She traced a pattern in the air with one elegant finger, and the markings on her skin shifted in response. And here I thought you were just enjoying the view. I'm trying to help you escape, he reminded her, though he couldn't quite suppress a smile. One doesn't preclude the other, her mental voice turned serious. But be careful, Ethan. Madame Serafina doesn't share well, and she's already noticed how you look at me. How do I look at you? Lyra's response was interrupted by approaching footsteps. She immediately shifted into her specimen pose, but not before sending him one last thought, like I'm more than just another pretty exhibit in her collection. It's refreshing, dangerous, but refreshing. The remainder of the day was a meticulous dance of inspections and data collection, but Ethan's mind kept returning to Lyra's words and to the way her skin seemed to shimmer with its own inner light when she spoke into his mind. He told himself it was purely scientific interest. The way his pulse quickened when she teased him was merely an autonomic response to a unique stimulus. That night, he returned again, armed with more questions about her people's technology. He found her tracing complex patterns in the air, her skin glowing softly in the darkness. Back so soon? Her mental voice carried a warmth that belied her sardonic words. Don't tell me you've fallen for my captivating personality already. I'm here for information, he insisted, pulling out his tablet. Of course you are. She moved closer to the field, her markings pulsing gently. Though you might want to control your pheromone levels if you're aiming for professional detachment. Ethan nearly choked. You can sense that too. I can sense many things, Dr. Vance, her mental tone was pure mischief. Now, including the fact that you find my scientific implications quite stimulating. This is serious, he protested, though he couldn't quite meet those stellar eyes. Everything's serious with humans, she sighed mentally. Very well. What would you like to know about my people's highly classified and potentially universe-altering temporal technology? When you put it that way. Exactly. Her mental voice softened. But since you ask so nicely, and since you're quite attractive when you blush, I'll tell you a story about the stars. The night deepened around them as Lyra wove her tale, her mental voice painting images of a civilization that had mastered time itself. Ethan found himself drawn closer to the containment field, captivated not only by the knowledge she shared but by the way her markings danced across her skin as she spoke. Your heart rate is elevated again, she teased during a pause in her story. Is it the temporal physics that excite you, or the temporal physics are fascinating? Ethan managed, trying to maintain his professional demeanor. Though your method of communication is equally intriguing. Intriguing? Lyra arched an elegant eyebrow. Is that what you call this connection between us? How very scientific of you. I'm here to help you escape, he reminded her, though his voice lacked conviction. Multitasking is permitted, you know. She moved closer to the field, close enough that he could see the complex pattern swirling in her eyes. Even serious human scientists are allowed to appreciate aesthetics. Your species' bioluminescent properties are certainly remarkable, fascinating, intriguing. Her mental laugh rippled through his mind. Your vocabulary becomes quite limited when you're flustered, Dr. Vance. Ethan cleared his throat. We should focus on the security systems. We are. Lyra traced a pattern in the air that made her skin shimmer. I'm teaching you to read our written language. The fact that you find the teacher distracting is hardly my fault. I'm not distracted, he insisted. No? She tilted her head, and the crystals adorning her ears caught the light. Then why have you been staring at my markings for the past 5 minutes instead of taking notes? I was analyzing their pattern recognition sequences, he protested weakly. Of course you were. Her mental tone dripped with amusement. And I suppose your pupils are dilated for purely academic reasons? Before Ethan could formulate a response, a distant alarm sounded. Lyra immediately stepped back, her playful demeanor vanishing. Security sweep, she warned. Though I must say, watching you scramble for composure has been the highlight of my imprisonment. I wasn't. Go, she insisted, though he caught a flash of regret in her mental voice. But Ethan, when you come back tomorrow, bring something to help you focus. Your scientific observations are becoming quite obvious. He slipped away into the shadows, his pulse still racing from more than just the close call. Back in his quarters, he tried to focus on the security schematics he'd gathered, but his mind kept drifting to the way Lyra's markings had pulsed in sync with her mental laughter. Focus, he muttered to himself. She's counting on you to be professional. He could have sworn he heard an echo of her mental voice. Professional doesn't mean immune, Dr. Vance. The next morning, during his official evaluation, Madame Serafina observed him like a hawk as he documented Lyra's enclosure. Lyra, for her part, put on a flawless performance of being an exotic specimen, though he didn't miss the way her movement seemed designed to showcase her luminescent patterns. Fascinating behavioral patterns, he commented blandly to Madame Serafina. Indeed, she replied, her tone sharp. Though I hope you're not getting too invested in this particular specimen. Purely scientific interest, Ethan assured her, even as Lyra executed a stretch that made her markings ripple like starlight on water. Lyra's voice whispered in his mind, making him nearly drop his tablet again. The game they were playing was dangerous, he knew one wrong move would give them away, but as Lyra's mental laughter echoed in his thoughts, warm and bright as distant stars, Ethan realized he was well past the point of professional detachment. He just hoped they'd both survive long enough for him to admit it. Through their nightly meetings, Ethan learned more about Lyra's people, the Aeron. Though each revelation was wrapped in her characteristic teasing. So you want to know about my species? Lyra's mental voice carried that now familiar hint of mischief. Or is this just another excuse to stare at my markings? Both, Ethan admitted, surprising himself with his honesty, though mostly I need to understand why they're hunting your people. Lyra's markings shifted to a deeper shade of violet, something he'd learned indicated either strong emotion or concentration. Bold of you to admit it. You're learning. She moved closer to the field, her stellar eyes holding his gaze. The Aeron were time weavers. These marks you're so fascinated by? They're not just decorative, they're living equations passed down through generations. Each pattern is a piece of temporal code. That's why they want you, Ethan breathed, understanding dawning. Your people could predict, not just predict. Lyra's mental tone turned serious. We could shape time itself. Small changes, subtle redirections, nothing dramatic enough to cause paradoxes, but enough to influence things. The implication staggered him. And that's why you were captured? Lyra's markings pulsed with a bitter luminescence. I was young, naive, thought I could warn a primitive world about an impending disaster. The wrong people noticed. Next thing I knew, I was rare specimen number 2187 in Madame Serafina's collection. How long have you been here? Long enough to perfect my exotic pet routine, she replied, then added with a mental smirk, though you saw through that rather quickly. Your heart does this interesting little skip when you're piecing things together. Ethan felt that very skip she mentioned. You're deflecting again, and you're blushing again. We all have our tells. But her mental voice softened. 5 years, if you must know. 5 years of being gawked at by the wealthy elite who never bothered to look past the pretty lights. I'm looking, Ethan said quietly. Lyra's markings rippled with an iridescent pattern he'd never seen before. Yes, she replied, her mental voice unexpectedly gentle, you certainly are. The moment stretched between them, charged with something that went beyond their usual playful banter. Ethan realized he'd stepped closer to the field than he'd intended, close enough to see the individual swirls of color in her eyes. Careful, Dr. Vance, she whispered in his mind. Your pheromone levels are practically shouting. Stop reading my biochemistry, he muttered, but didn't step back. Stop making it so interesting. Her markings pulsed in what he now recognized as amusement. Though I must admit, your particular chemical cocktail of attraction and professional guilt is quite entertaining. I'm trying to save you, he protested. And falling in love with me in the process, her mental voice carried both warmth and warning. Don't deny it. I can literally sense your physiological responses. Ethan didn't deny it, couldn't deny it, not when every cell in his body seemed to resonate with her presence. Is that going to be a problem? Lyra's markings shifted through several complex patterns before settling into a soft, steady glow. It should be. It's definitely not going to make things easier. A pause, then, but no, Ethan, it's not a problem. No? No, her mental voice carried a smile. Because, contrary to what humans seem to think, Aaron aren't just living computers. We feel too, deeply, completely. Her eyes met his, dangerously. Before Ethan could respond, she added, though your timing could use work. Falling for a prisoner you're trying to rescue, very cliché. I thought you said you could see possible futures? He challenged, falling back into their familiar banter despite his racing heart. Shouldn't you have predicted this? Oh, I saw it coming, Lyra admitted, her mental tone rich with affection. I just didn't predict how much I'd enjoy watching you try to stay professional about it. A distant sound made them both tense. Lyra stepped back, but her mental voice lingered. Come back tomorrow. I'll teach you more about temporal mechanics, and maybe explain why your presence makes my markings glow brighter. As Ethan slipped away, he knew he was well past the point of no return. He was in love with her. Her intelligence, her strength, her sardonic humor, even her ability to read his every reaction only made her more captivating. Now, he just had to figure out how to break her out of a maximum security facility while half the galaxy's power players wanted to exploit her abilities. And somehow maintain enough professional composure to convince Madame Serafina he wasn't completely captivated by her most prized specimen. Lyra's amused mental whisper followed him. Good luck with that last part, dear doctor. Your heart rate gives you away every time. Ethan spent the next week meticulously documenting every security measure on Elysium Prime while pretending to conduct his evaluation. During the day, he maintained his professional facade. At night, he met with Lyra, their planning sessions increasingly interwoven with moments that blurred the line between strategy and something more. Your species has such interesting mating rituals, Lyra observed one evening after Ethan had stumbled over a particularly obvious display of attraction. All this pretense of professional distance while your body practically shouts your interest. Says the woman who keeps reading my biochemistry without permission? Would you prefer I pretend not to notice? Her mental voice carried that familiar mix of teasing and genuine affection. Besides, your attempts to maintain scientific objectivity while clearly wanting to kiss me are highly entertaining. Ethan nearly dropped his tablet. I never said you didn't have to. Her markings pulsed with what he now recognized as satisfaction. Though I should warn you, Aaron kisses involve a temporary melding of consciousness. Think you could handle that, Dr. Vance? The thought sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with fear. We should focus on the escape plan. We are. Lyra's mental tone turned serious, though her eyes still sparkled. Understanding each other, trusting each other, it's all part of survival. The fact that you find me irresistible is just a bonus. I never said irresistible. Your dopamine levels did. She paused, then added more softly. And for what it's worth, the feeling is mutual, though watching you try to maintain professional composure is far too amusing to stop. The exhibition gala approached rapidly. Their plan was solid, or as solid as any plan could be when it involved breaking out the most valuable specimen from the galaxy's most secure private zoo. Lyra's precognitive abilities had helped them map out several possible escape routes, though she admitted the future became increasingly unclear the further ahead she looked. Time isn't fixed, she explained one night, her markings tracing temporal equations in the air. It's more like a probability cloud. The closer an event, the more clearly I can see its potential paths. And our escape, how clearly can you see that? Lyra's markings dimmed slightly. There are complications, variables I can't quite grasp. She met his eyes, including how strongly you affect my predictions. What do you mean? Your presence changes things? Her mental voice carried a note of wonder. It's like you create new possibilities just by existing. My people would have found that fascinating. And you, what do you find it? Her markings pulsed with colors he'd never seen before. Terrifying, exhilarating. A pause. Worth the risk? The night before the gala, they made their final preparations. The plan was precise. During the exhibition of new specimens, when security would be focused on the main display areas, they would use the maintenance tunnels to reach the facility's power core. Ethan would trigger a cascading system failure while Lyra used her abilities to navigate them through the chaos. Remember, Lyra cautioned, once we start, there's no going back. You'll be throwing away your career, your reputation. Worth it, Ethan interrupted, surprising them both with his certainty. Lyra's markings flared with sudden brightness. Your heart rate just did that thing again. Stop reading my biochemistry. Stop making it so interesting. Her mental voice softened. Though I suppose if we're about to risk everything together, I should admit something. What? That pattern I showed you, the one about air and kisses involving consciousness melding. Her mental tone carried a hint of mischief. I may have exaggerated slightly just to see how you'd react. Ethan laughed despite himself. You're impossible. True. Her eyes met his, starlight dancing in their depths. But you love that about me. He couldn't deny it, didn't want to deny it anymore. We should get some rest before tomorrow. We should, Lyra agreed, then added telepathically as he turned to leave. And Ethan, when this works, when we're free, I'll show you what an actual Aaron kiss is like. Her mental laughter followed him down the corridor along with the certainty that whatever happened tomorrow, his life would never be the same. The morning of the gala arrived, with artificial dawn creeping across Elysium Prime's perfectly manicured grounds. Ethan adjusted his formal attire, feeling the weight of the modified security codes in his hidden data chip. Show time, he muttered to himself, remembering Lyra's last mental touch from the night before. The exhibition hall buzzed with elite guests from across the galaxy. Madame Serafina stood at the center, resplendent in a gown that shifted colors like Lyra's markings, a detail that made Ethan's jaw clench. Dr. Vance, she beckoned him over, perfect timing. I was just telling the Centurion ambassador about your thorough evaluation of our facility. All according to protocol, Ethan replied smoothly, checking his chronometer. 3 minutes until Lyra would initiate her part of the plan. The lights flickered, right on schedule. Minor power fluctuation, Madame Serafina assured her guests. Our backup systems? The entire hall plunged into darkness. In the ensuing chaos, Ethan moved with practiced precision toward Lyra's enclosure, his path memorized from countless nighttime visits. He heard her before he saw her, her mental voice guiding him through the darkness. The guards are taking positions at the primary exits, she informed him. But they've forgotten about the maintenance shaft, just as we predicted. The containment field died with a soft whine as Ethan's codes did their work. Lyra stepped out, her markings providing just enough light to navigate by. Your heart's racing again, she teased mentally, even as they slipped into the service tunnel. Really, you're reading my biochemistry now? It's either that or focus on how many ways this could go wrong. Her mental voice tightened, and trust me, I can see quite a few potential futures where this ends badly. They reached the first junction when the alarms finally blared. Lyra's markings pulsed with sudden urgency. They're activating the neural containment grid, she warned. That wasn't in any of the futures I saw. Can you bypass it? Not alone. Her eyes met his in the dim light. But together? How do you feel about a crash course in air and temporal mechanics? What followed was the strangest scientific collaboration of Ethan's life. Lyra's consciousness merged partially with his, guiding his hands as they rewired control panels, her knowledge of time itself helping them stay just ahead of their pursuers. This would be fascinating under different circumstances, Ethan managed as they raced through another corridor. Lyra's mental laugh was strained, but genuine. Only you would treat this as a research opportunity. They were almost to the landing bay when Madame Serafina's voice echoed through the facility. Did you really think we didn't know about the air and temporal nexus, Lyra? That we kept you just for show? A pause. Your people's home world calls to you, doesn't it? The power there, we can take you to it. Lyra froze, her markings flickering with shock. She knows about everything. Lyra, we have to go there, she interrupted, already plotting their descent to my home world. If she knows about the nexus, others will too. It has to be destroyed. The original plan was just changed. Her eyes met his, starlight swirling in their depths. Are you with me? Ethan's answer was cut off by the sound of approaching guards. In that moment, he made his choice, not just to help her escape, but to follow wherever this led, always. I said, he said, and meant it. Lyra's markings flared with something that might have been joy, might have been fear, might have been both. Then let me show you how errands really fly. What happened next would rewrite several laws of physics. Lyra's consciousness merged more fully with his as they commandeered a ship, her knowledge of temporal mechanics letting them exist slightly out of sync with normal time, just enough to stay ahead of their pursuers. You know, she commented as they broke atmosphere, for someone experiencing his first temporal shift, your molecular stability is impressive. Is that a compliment or a medical observation? Can it be both? Her mental voice carried tension beneath the teasing. The nexus will be guarded. What's left of my homeworld, it won't be easy. Ethan reached for her hand, noting how her markings pulsed brighter at the contact. Nothing about this has been easy, why start now? Lyra's response was interrupted by the first shots from their pursuers, beginning a chase that would lead them to the heart of air and space, and a confrontation that would determine not just their fate but the fate of time itself. The chase through hyperspace became a dance of temporal mathematics and pure instinct. Lyra's markings created complex navigational patterns in the darkness of their stolen ship's cockpit, each pulse of light revealing another possible escape route. 2 degrees starboard, she directed mentally, and stop thinking so loudly about how beautiful my markings are. It's distracting. I thought you couldn't read my biochemistry as clearly now, Ethan said, executing the maneuver. I can't, her mental voice carried a hint of smugness, but your expressions are becoming remarkably easy to read. A blast from their pursuers rocked the ship. Lyra's markings flared as she calculated temporal probabilities. The good news is, there's a path through this debris field that leads to my home world, she announced. The bad news is, it requires perfect synchronization between pilot and navigator. And the worst news, we'll have to maintain partial consciousness melding the entire time. She turned those stellar eyes on him. Think you can handle being in my head that long, Dr. Vance? I've managed so far, he replied, trying to sound professional despite the way his pulse jumped at the suggestion. Barely. Her mental laugh wrapped around his thoughts. Your scientific composure cracks every time we connect. Says the woman who glows brighter whenever another blast cut him off. Lyra's markings shifted into emergency patterns as she initiated the meld. Suddenly, Ethan could see what she saw, multiple timelines overlapping, showing every possible path through the debris. Focus, she urged mentally, though he felt her amusement at his awe. Unless you'd rather discuss how your neurons light up whenever we connect. They threaded through the impossible debris field, their shared consciousness allowing for split-second adjustments. Ethan found himself catching glimpses of Lyra's memories, her people's fall, her capture, and, surprisingly, frequent moments of her watching him during their planning sessions at Elysium Prime. You were studying me too, he realized. Purely scientific interest, of course, she threw his own words back at him, her mental voice warm with affection. Though your human mating rituals of pretending not to stare were particularly fascinating. I wasn't, Ethan, her thought voice turned serious as they emerged from the debris field. Look! The ruins of her homeworld hung before them, suspended in multiple moments of time. Parts of the planet showed a thriving civilization, others complete destruction, all existing simultaneously in an impossible temporal paradox. The nexus point, Lyra explained, her markings dimming with old grief. The heart of our temporal science, and the reason my people were destroyed. It's incredible, Ethan breathed, then felt her consciousness tense against his. What's wrong? Madame Serafina's ship, Lyra's markings pulsed with warning patterns. She beat us here somehow. She knew. We can still. No time, Lyra interrupted, already plotting their descent. The nexus is destabilizing, can't you feel it? Through their connected minds, he could. The temporal energies were building toward something catastrophic. Lyra, he started, not sure what to say but needing to say something. I know, she replied, both mentally and aloud. Her markings created patterns he'd never seen before, complex and beautiful and slightly sad. For what it's worth, falling in love with a human scientist wasn't in any of my predicted futures. Before Ethan could process that admission, they were entering the atmosphere, racing against time itself toward what was left of the great Aeron Temple and whatever ending awaited them there. The temple loomed before them, its crystalline spires fracturing reality into 1,000 possible moments. As they landed, Lyra's markings pulsed with increasing urgency. The temporal energies are reaching critical levels, she warned. Their minds still partially merged from the flight. Madame Serafina's interference has destabilized the nexus. Can we stabilize it? We? Lyra's mental voice carried surprised warmth, despite the situation. Still trying to save everything, Dr. Vance? Old habits, he reached for her hand as they exited the ship. Besides, I've grown rather fond of this timeline. Her markings flickered with what might have been a blush, but before she could respond, Madame Serafina's voice cut through the temporal distortions. How touching! She emerged from the temple entrance, flanked by armed guards and scientists. The specimen and her lovesick rescuer, right on schedule. You knew we'd come? Lyra stated, her grip tightening on Ethan's hand. Of course, we've been studying your people's temporal technology for decades. This, Serafina gestured at the fracturing reality around them, was simply the final step. Your escape was predicted, planned for. Your connection to Dr. Vance, she smiled coldly, well, that was an unexpected but useful variable. Lyra's consciousness pressed against Ethan's, sharing a rapid series of calculations. The nexus point is deteriorating faster than even I had predicted. You can't control this, Lyra warned aloud, while mentally showing Ethan what needed to be done. The temporal energies are already cascading. With your help we can, Serafina's smile widened. Your markings contain the key sequences. Cooperate, and perhaps we'll let your human pet live. Ethan felt Lyra's mind spark with sudden determination. You know what's fascinating about human biochemistry? She asked conversationally, her markings beginning an intricate dance. This hardly seems the time, Serafina started. It's so predictable, Lyra continued, a consciousness weaving deeper into Ethan's. For instance, I knew exactly when Ethan would fall in love with me, knew when he'd choose to help me, knew he'd follow me here. Ethan felt her power building, using their connection as an amplifier. Lyra? But Aeron, her markings blazed now, were anything but predictable. The temporal nexus responded to her call, energy coursing through her markings like living light. Through their merged consciousness, Ethan understood her plan. You'll die, he protested mentally. Her response came with a wave of affection. That's one possibility, but I've seen others. Trust me.